A boy of 7 is torn from his mother's arms and marched into the wilderness. He will not return to a warm bed for the next 13 years. He will be starved on purpose, forced to steal food to survive, beaten without mercy, and taught that pain is not punishment, it is preparation. If he cries, he is weak. If he dies, no one will speak his name with pity. This is not a nightmare. This is childhood in ancient Sparta. For 300 years, one city on a dusty plain in southern Greece built a machine unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen, not a machine of bronze and iron, but of flesh, discipline, and terror. While other Greek cities raised philosophers, poets, and merchants, Sparta raised soldiers, and only soldiers. Every citizen was a weapon. Every law existed to serve the battlefield. Somewhere between a myth and a warning, the Spartans became the most feared warriors of the ancient world, men whose reputation alone could make an enemy army hesitate before a single spear was thrown. But how does a society decide to sacrifice everything, art, comfort, even love, for war? And what happens to a civilization built entirely on the edge of a blade when that edge finally breaks? In the southern Peloponnese, where the Eurotas River cuts a fertile valley between the Taygetos and Parnon mountains, the story of Sparta begins not with legend, but with land. Around the 11th century BCE, waves of Dorian Greek peoples migrated into the region, settling among the earlier Mycenaean populations. By the 8th century BCE, several villages had merged into a single city-state, Sparta, through a process the Greeks called synoikismos. Unlike Athens, which grew into a sprawling urban center of temples and marketplaces, Sparta remained, by ancient accounts, almost deliberately unimpressive. It had no great walls for centuries, because its citizens believed their bodies were the only defense the city would ever need. The turning point that shaped everything came from hunger for land. Sparta's population grew, but its territory could not feed it. To the west lay Messenia, a rich agricultural region populated by fellow Greeks. In the late 8th century BCE, Sparta invaded. The First Messenian War, fought over roughly 2 decades, ended in Spartan conquest. The Messenians were not driven out, enslaved in foreign markets, or absorbed as citizens. Instead, they were transformed into a new and chilling class of people, the Helots, a subjugated population forced to farm the land for their Spartan masters while retaining a strange, dangerous status, not quite slaves in the way other Greeks understood slavery, not remotely free. This decision, to rule not through assimilation but through permanent domination of a much larger subject population, became the hidden engine of everything Sparta would become. The Spartans were, by most ancient estimates, vastly outnumbered by the Helots they controlled. Fear of revolt was not paranoia, it was mathematics. When the Messenians rose up in a great rebellion in the mid-7th century BCE, the war dragged on for years and shook Spartan society to its foundations. Sparta survived, but barely, and the experience convinced its leaders of something they would never forget: control this precarious could only be maintained by permanent military readiness. A part-time army was not enough. Sparta needed a population that was never anything but soldiers. This is where the figure of Lycurgus enters the story, a lawgiver whose existence ancient historians themselves debated. Plutarch, writing centuries later, admitted that even in antiquity nothing about Lycurgus could be stated with certainty. He may have been a real reformer of the 9th or 8th century BCE, or a symbolic figure onto whom later Spartans projected their entire way of life. What matters historically is not whether one man designed it, but that by the 6th century BCE, Sparta had built a social and legal system unlike any other Greek city, a system the Spartans themselves called the Great Leuctra, and which modern historians refer to as the Lycurgan reforms. At the heart of this system was the Agoge, the state-controlled education and training regimen imposed on every Spartan boy. At around age 7, boys were removed from their homes and placed into the care of the state. They lived in communal barracks, ate together, trained together, and were subjected to a curriculum designed to produce absolute obedience and physical endurance. Ancient sources describe deliberate underfeeding, forcing boys to supplement their rations by stealing, not because theft was condoned, but because the ability to steal without being caught was itself considered a lesson in cunning and self-reliance. If caught, the punishment was severe, not for the theft, but for the failure of skill. Spartan boys trained barefoot to toughen their feet. They wore a single garment through winter to build tolerance for cold. They were taught to speak in short, blunt sentences, a style of speech so associated with the region of Laconia that it gave the English language the word laconic. Reading and writing were taught only minimally. The Agoge was not designed to produce scholars. It was designed to produce men who could endure hardship without complaint and follow orders without hesitation. At age 12, the training intensified. Older boys mentored younger ones in a structured system of pairs. And physical competition, including organized fights, was used to instill toughness and hierarchy. At 18, promising young men could enter the Cryptia, a secretive institution whose exact function is still debated by historians. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, describe it as a covert operation in which young Spartan men were sent into the countryside, sometimes tasked with killing helots considered troublesome or dangerous, deliberately without warning. If true, the Cryptia represented something chilling, state-sanctioned terror used to keep an enslaved population too afraid to organize resistance. Historians disagree on how widespread or literal this practice was, but the very existence of the tradition reveals how deeply fear of the helots shaped Spartan society. By age 20, a Spartan man became eligible for full citizenship, but citizenship itself came with brutal conditions. He was required to join a syssition, a communal dining group, where he ate simple meals, most famously a notoriously unappetizing black broth, alongside his fellow warriors every single day for the rest of his active military life. He could not choose to live separately from his unit. He could not opt out of military duty. If he failed to meet the physical and financial obligations required to remain in his dining group, he could lose his citizenship entirely, becoming what the Spartans called lesser, stripped of the rights that defined a true Spartiate. Spartan women lived under a radically different set of expectations than women elsewhere in Greece. While Athenian women were largely confined to domestic life, Spartan women were required to exercise, wrestle, and train physically, based on the belief, recorded by ancient writers including Xenophon, that strong mothers produce strong sons. Spartan women also held property rights unusual for the ancient Greek world, and some ancient accounts suggest they controlled a significant portion of Spartan land, since their husbands were frequently away at war or living communally in barracks. Aristotle, writing generations later with clear disapproval, complained that Spartan women had too much freedom and too much influence over Spartan wealth, a striking admission that even Sparta's critics acknowledged the unusual position of its women. Governing this warrior society was a political structure that balanced monarchy, aristocracy, and a limited form of citizen participation. Sparta was unusual among Greek states for having not one king, but two, ruling simultaneously from two separate royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. This dual kingship, whatever its ancient origins, served a practical purpose. it prevented any single king from consolidating absolute power, and it meant one king could remain in Sparta while the other led armies into the field. Alongside the king stood a council of elders called the Gerousia, composed of men over the age of 60 who served for life, and an assembly of citizens called the Apella, which could vote yes or no on proposals but had no power to debate or amend them. Overseeing all of this were 5 annually elected officials called the Ephors, who held remarkable power. They could even bring charges against a king. Military service defined the entire purpose of this political and social machine, and Spartan military doctrine centered on one formation, the phalanx. Spartan hoplites fought in a tightly packed rectangular formation, shields overlapping, spears extended, each man's shield protecting not only himself but the exposed side of the soldier beside him. The formation's strength depended entirely on cohesion. If one section broke and ran, the men beside them became vulnerable, and the whole line could collapse. This is why Spartan training obsessed over discipline above individual heroics. A Spartan soldier's highest virtue was not personal glory in single combat, but the willingness to hold the line beside his brothers no matter the cost. Spartan hoplites carried a large round shield called the aspes, a short thrusting spear called the doru, and a secondary short sword for close combat if the spear broke or was lost. They wore bronze armor when they could afford it, the famous crested helmet, breastplate, and greaves, though the degree of standardized equipment likely varied more than popular imagination suggests. What set the Spartans apart was not necessarily superior weaponry, but reputation, the near-mythical belief, shared across the Greek world, that no army fought with the same suicidal discipline as the men of Sparta. According to a tradition recorded by Plutarch, Spartan mothers were said to tell their sons departing for war to return with this shield, or on it, meaning return victorious, carrying your shield, or return dead, carried upon it, but never return having thrown the shield away to flee. For nearly 2 centuries after the Messenian Wars, Sparta expanded its influence across the Peloponnese, forming a network of alliances historians call the Peloponnesian League. By the early 5th century BCE, Sparta stood as the preeminent land power in Greece, and then a far greater threat arrived from the east. The Persian Empire, under King Darius and later his son Xerxes, sought to bring mainland Greece under its control. In 480 BCE, Xerxes assembled what ancient sources describe as an enormous invasion force, crossing into Greece from the north. The Greek city-states, usually fractured by rivalry, formed an uneasy alliance to resist. A small force was sent north to hold the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Among them stood 300 Spartan hoplites, led by King Leonidas I of the Aegead line, alongside several thousand allied Greek soldiers from other city-states. For 3 days, this vastly outnumbered force held the narrow pass against the Persian army, using the terrain to neutralize the invaders' numerical advantage. On the final day, after a local resident named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the defenders, Leonidas made the decision to send most of the allied Greek troops away while he and his remaining men, including the Spartans, stayed to fight a rearguard action. Herodotus records that the defenders fought to the last man. Tradition holds that when the Persians demanded the Greeks lay down their weapons, Leonidas responded with 2 words that would echo through history, molon labe, come and take them. Thermopylae was, by any strict military measure, a defeat. But its cultural impact was the opposite of failure. The battle became the foundation of the Spartan legend, proof, in the eyes of the ancient world, that Spartan discipline could turn hopeless odds into eternal glory. The following year, in 479 BCE, a much larger Greek army, with Sparta providing the largest contingent and overall command under the regent Pausanias, met Persian forces at the Battle of Plataea. The Greek coalition won decisively, effectively ending the Persian invasion of mainland Greece. Sparta's reputation as Greece's premier land power was no longer myth. It was proven. But victory over a foreign empire did not bring lasting peace among the Greeks themselves. In the decades that followed, Athens transformed its wartime alliance into a maritime empire, growing wealthy and powerful through control of the Aegean Sea. Sparta watched this growth with mounting suspicion. Two fundamentally different visions of Greek life, Athenian democracy, trade, and naval expansion against Spartan military conservatism and land-based dominance, set the two powers on a collision course. In 431 BCE, this tension exploded into the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would consume the Greek world for nearly 3 decades. The early years of the war followed a grim pattern. Sparta's army, unmatched on land, could ravage the Athenian countryside almost at will, but could not breach Athens's fortified walls or challenge its navy at sea. Athens, in turn, used its fleet to raid Spartan territory but could not decisively defeat Sparta's land forces. The war ground on through plague, shifting alliances, and brutal atrocities on both sides, including massacres of civilian populations that shocked even contemporary observers. Sparta's fortunes changed dramatically when it began accepting funding from an unlikely source, the Persian Empire, the very power Sparta had helped defeat 2 generations earlier. With Persian gold, Sparta built a navy capable of directly challenging Athens at sea, something that would have seemed unthinkable a generation before. The final blow came in 405 BCE at the Battle of Agoge, where the Spartan general Lysander destroyed the Athenian fleet, cutting off the grain supply routes that fed the city. Starved and besieged, Athens surrendered in 404 BCE. Its great walls were torn down. Its empire was dismantled. Sparta stood as the unchallenged hegemon of the Greek world. Yet the victory that should have secured Sparta's dominance instead exposed its deepest weakness. Sparta had built a society optimized entirely for war, but it had never developed the administrative, economic, or diplomatic structures needed to govern a wider empire. Spartan generals and governors installed in conquered territories were often accused of corruption and brutality that alienated the very allies who had helped Sparta win the war. At home, an old demographic crisis was quietly worsening. The number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates who alone could serve in the phalanx as equals, had been shrinking for generations, a phenomenon later Greek writers called oliganthropia, or the scarcity of men. Constant warfare killed soldiers who could never be fully replaced, because Spartan citizenship required an unbroken chain of land ownership, participation in the communal dining groups, and completion of the Agoge, conditions an increasingly small elite could actually meet. By the 4th century BCE, some ancient estimates suggest the number of full Spartan citizens had fallen dramatically from what it had been at the time of the Persian invasion. This hidden fragility was exposed catastrophically in 371 BCE. At the Battle of Leuctra, a Theban army under the innovative general Epaminondas faced a Spartan-led force. Epaminondas abandoned the traditional even-depth phalanx formation and instead concentrated his best troops in an unusually deep formation on one flank, striking with overwhelming local force against the Spartan right wing, where the Spartan king Cleombrotus I commanded. The tactic shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility in a single afternoon. Cleombrotus was killed, and a significant portion of Sparta's remaining full citizen soldiers died on the field, losses the shrinking Spartan population could not absorb. The consequences unfolded quickly. Epaminondas followed his victory by invading Spartan territory itself, something no Greek army had successfully done in centuries, precisely because Sparta had never needed walls. Even more devastating, Epaminondas liberated Messenia, freeing the Helot population that had labored under Spartan control for over 300 years and helping them found an independent city. The economic foundation of the entire Spartan system, land worked by subjugated Messenian Helots, was gone. Sparta never recovered the population, the territory, or the power it had held before Leuctra. Sparta continued to exist for centuries afterward, first as a diminished regional power, later absorbed into the shifting political landscape of Hellenistic Greece, and eventually as a subject territory within the Roman world. Some Roman-era writers describe a strange phenomenon: wealthy Romans visiting Sparta specifically to watch staged reenactments of the harsh Spartan upbringing, treating the Agoge as a kind of historical spectacle rather than a living system. The warrior culture that had once made the rest of Greece tremble had become, in its final centuries, something closer to a museum performance for foreign tourists. What endured, long after Sparta's political power faded, was the idea of Sparta, an idea that proved more powerful and more dangerous than the city-state itself ever was. Ancient writers, particularly Athenian authors like Xenophon and Plutarch, romanticized Spartan discipline as a model of civic virtue, often glossing over the brutal machinery of Helot oppression and state terror that made that discipline possible. This idealized image of Sparta echoed through later centuries, invoked by thinkers, revolutionaries, and, most disturbingly, by 20th-century totalitarian movements that admired Sparta's eugenic practices and militarized society for reasons that had nothing to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with justifying their own ideologies. Understanding the real Sparta means holding two truths at once: extraordinary discipline and courage on the battlefield, built upon a foundation of permanent, violent control over a population that vastly outnumbered its rulers. The story of Sparta is, in the end, a story about the price of survival through total specialization. A small population, terrified of the much larger enslaved population it depended on for food, built the most rigid military culture in the ancient world to maintain control. That culture produced soldiers capable of astonishing feats at Thermopylae and Plataea, men whose discipline became legendary across the ancient world and remains legendary today. But that same rigidity, the refusal to adapt its citizenship system, its economy, or its treatment of the Helots, meant that when the battlefield finally turned against Sparta at Leuctra, the entire structure had no capacity to bend. It could only break. The most feared warriors of the ancient world were not undone by a stronger enemy's sword. They were undone by the same unyielding system that had made them fearsome in the first place.